next part of my talk is I gave a paper to a biological farming conference about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm going to share some of the slides on that. And you may remember, if you're following the trends on what's happening in farming, like organic farming was the big change from conventional farming many years ago. And then biological farming gained a bit of popularity and impetus about 10 years ago. And you know, right at the moment, regenerative farming's very popular. So it's interesting that I've kind of seen these different changes happening. But this is a talk that I gave, as I say, about 7 or 8 years ago. And my title was, Are Microorganisms the Key to Solving Environmental Issues Around Intensive Pastoral Farming? So, what can we learn from nature? And how can we implement what we learn? Using microorganisms as a farm management tool. So I talk about those items. Now, nature. You know, this is a natural rainforest, and so what is common about some of the features of a rainforest are that they've been there for millions of years, right? Tens of thousands of millions, and they're self-perpetuating and self-sustaining, and they're healthy, and they are. The water that flows out of those native forests the water's very pure and clean, pristine. So what's the feature of a rainforest? So you have a big range, and you have diversity of plants. You have canopy, you have subcanopy, you have lower level plants, and you have the forest floor, and the forest floor is never bare earth. It's always covered. It's covered with a mulch, a natural mulch, and with plants. And there's an example of the forest floor. So, and there's an example of the low growth, and then the taller trees. So what can we learn from nature and apply to our farming systems? So if we think about those rainforests, then firstly we must protect our waterways. So, you know, this is a sort of a model of a farm, but you can see where they've fenced off the near the riparian zone, they call it. So it's fenced off, and then they've planted it, and that's to protect that waterway. And then here's a good example on a farm where they've done that, and they've fenced it off, and it's planted out in natives. That's to protect the waterway. And then I go on to say, okay, so when we go farming, we actually severely modify the environment compared to, say, a rainforest, don't we? So we have to try and adopt some of the things that we know work in a rainforest that have been working and sustaining for a long time. How can we apply those to our farming systems? So how do we get a diverse and abundant microbial ecosystem and provide food for the microbes? This is a report by the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, and they stated the importance of organic matter in agriculture. And it said microorganisms are responsible for the mineralization and immobilization of NP and S through the decomposition of organic matter. And then it said, and this is a key one, Available nutrients that are not taken up by the plant are retained by soil organisms. In organic matter depleted soils, these nutrients will be lost through the system through leaching and runoff. So this is a key one. If you have an active microorganism microbial ecosystem in your soil, then they have the ability to retain the nutrients. And I've said it, I reinforce that down below by saying organic matter retains plant nutrients and prevents them leaching to deeper soil layers. So how do we increase organic matter and biology in pastoral systems? Now, this was obviously aimed at farmers when we gave this talk. Diverse pastures. This is one of the things that I researched actually when I was at Ag Research, was we called them multi-species pastures or mixed herb layers. And there's a good example of a diverse pasture. It's got legumes, it's got grasses, it's got herbs. And if you look at this diagram, it shows you how the different plant types grow and their root systems and how they diversify. You see the chicory there with the big taproot. It's going down. It can go down and break up some of the harder subsoil. And then some of these other plants have more fibrous roots and so on. So that's diversity of plants gives you a diversity of rooting systems. And if here's a little, this was a research paper that I read. So Coxford, Phalaris and brown top have double the root mass compared to ryegrass. Now, what's 90% of our pastures in New Zealand are ryegrass, but some of the other species are actually better. They have double the root mass. If you've got a bigger root mass, you're going to have more. You've got more capability of harvesting, catching the nutrients. Overseas studies indicate corpus and prairie grass also significantly exceed the root mass of ryegrass at depths of 100 millimeters or more. And these two authors, Popé and Crush, also found a strong negative correlation between root mass and N leaching. So therefore, if you have more root mass, you're going to have less N leaching into the groundwater, which is a big concern these days. Diverse species provide diverse root exudates, and that they provide food for the microbes, and therefore more species of microbes. So that's why, you know, in the regen farming is very big on diverse pastures. Now, in another study, dry matter production from diverse pastures was comparable with that of standard pastures. So you're not getting a reduction in production if you have a diverse pasture. Diverse pastures were less affected by water stress, so they're more drought tolerant. And then this study said milk's solid production from cows grazing diverse pastures were similar to standard. So there's no reduction in cow production either by having diverse pastures. And that was given by that was a dairy technical paper at Lincoln University. Diverse pastures containing up to 5 plant species were compared with perennial ryegrass pastures in New Zealand. And the nitrogen concentration of urine and N excreted by cows was lower when growing diverse pastures. And you wonder why they're not using them, wouldn't you? Or why they're not using them more. Diverse pastures may be a useful tool for reducing nitrate leaching or maintaining or increasing milk solid production. And this was given by a professor of dairy production at Lincoln University. So you'd think that the dairy industry would be using more diverse pastures, wouldn't you, given that information? So how do we increase organic matter and biology in pastoral systems? We can top, you know, there used to be the old theory that you had to eat every blade of grass, but now it's changing, and we know that any grass that does not get eaten by the animals forms mulch and becomes a food for the microbes. So topping is useful. The only problem with topping is it burns diesel. Then sabbatical fallows. So you will know about a sabbatical fallow. So that goes right back to biblical times. You know, 1 year out of every 7 being the land's totally rested. So here's an example of a pasture that has a lot of dead material just sort of mulching back down into the soil. So what I went on to say in my paper was, how do we increase organic matter and biology in pastoral systems? We can add compost. And there's a compost plant in Christchurch. We can do targeted biological inputs. And this is where we can apply biofertilizers. So a biofertilizer is a nutrient substrate with microbes included. And India is quite big in biofertilizers. And then biological fertilizers. These are fertilizers that actually both stimulate microbes and add microbes. And then there's brew extracts, e.g. compost teas, and we just talked about them. So compost tea is another way of adding biology. And then there's formulated brews, and this is where EM fits in. So EM is a formulated brew, and then I go on to describe what EM is in my paper. So it's a liquid product with diverse combination. Developed in Japan, 20+ years of use. Used in 150 countries. 2010, there were 4 million litres produced and used. And in 2012, there was almost 9 million, 4 million, 2010, 9 million in 2012. I don't know what it is today. But anyway, that's, and just going on about EM, this is out of a book which looked at, you may have heard the term plant growth regulators. So there are plant growth regulators that are synthetically produced, but there are some that are naturally produced. So if you look at this was just copied out of a book, and it's plant growth regulators producing so these plant growth regulators from microbes that are contained in EM. So, for example, actinomycetes, they produce these plant growth regulators. Cytokinins, gibberellic acid. I don't know these full names without looking it up. Now here's streptomyces, that's producing some plant growth regulators. Aspergillus, Mucormycosis, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And that is yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So anyway, those microorganisms are all within EM, and they produce plant growth regulators. Now, they produce them naturally. So when you use microorganisms or you or you encourage them in your soil, these are some of the things they produce, which aids plant growth. And this is a published paper in an international journal, and it was a review paper looking at effective microorganisms and their influence on vegetable production. And this is by a Polish lady. I've actually met this lady. Estonia. And she concluded, among 22 reports on the effects of EM on the yields of vegetable, 84% positive. And I can't quite read how many were negative, but concluded that EM can improve the quality and yield of vegetables by reducing the incidence of pest diseases. So that was a review paper, and then this was a paper out of China, and it was an 11-year study looking at applying compost and how it affected the yield of wheat. And they found that by enhancing the compost with EM, they improved the yield over standard compost. They improved the yield and the uptake of nutrients. So I concluded my talk by saying our own research on EM has shown increased yields, increased health and quality of crops, and when combined with some fertilizers, an increase in yield per unit of fertilizer applied. And this is really important because when we have a very strong microbial influence in our soil, we can get away with much less fertilizer, and in some cases, no fertilizer. So in conclusion, that was my catch cry: diversity, diversity, diversity. Trees protect riparian area, wetlands. Grow trees, protect the riparian area and have wetlands. Diverse pastures, increase organic matter levels. Strategic use of microbial inputs. Use of microbe-friendly fertilizers. This is important. The sum of all will help to achieve the end goal. So, there's not one silver bullet for everything. There's lots of different ways of achieving the end goal. So that was the biological farming paper that I gave 7 odd years ago. So I've just put up their website there and my email if anyone wants to take that down. But that kind of concludes the farming part of my talk.